30% of the walking population is vitamin A toxic. No one should ever eat liver. Ever. And this is not just a theory.
Just a theory.
The symptoms of vitamin A deficiency are very, very close to those for vitamin A toxicity. That 1926 Wolbach and Howe study, they used heated casein. They fed this diet, what they thought was a vitamin A deficient diet, to these animals, and they all died in 10 to 12 weeks. And they said, oh my God, we've discovered vitamin A deficiency. Well, no, they didn't. They discovered vitamin A toxicity because this was a toxic diet they fed to these animals.
A toxic diet.
Is Grant Genereux right about vitamin A deficiency? Did the early researchers botch the vitamin A deficiency experiments as Grant Genereux has laid out in his book, Poisoning for Profits? And is casein, protein, and lard so full of toxic vitamin A that it absolutely decimated the rats in the deficiency experiments? In this video, we are going to cover all three of these questions. Now, why are we covering these specific questions? Because these deficiency studies that Grant Genereux discusses lay the foundation for this low vitamin A perspective. So the major perspective that was laid out in Grant Genereux's Poisoning for Profits book was that vitamin A is quite toxic, which we already debunked that in the previous video. And then he also was trying to show that vitamin A deficiency doesn't actually exist. It's actually vitamin A toxicity. So in this video, we are going to directly address this. Before we jump in, the next vitamin A video that I am going to be making will break down the metabolism, the excretion, and the storage of vitamin A as discussed by Grant Genereux and also as discussed by Dr. Garrett Smith. So if you'd like to see this low vitamin A perspective completely put to rest, hit that subscribe button and a notification bell so you can get notified when that video is going to come out. In Grant's book, Poisoning for Profits, he attempts to discredit vitamin A deficiency as not being real. And spoiler alert here, he actually failed. Grant starts out in his book questioning the timeline of the deficiency studies and also the extent of the damage inside the deficiency studies. So we have a quote here. The glaring problem here with this long list of disease conditions is how could any reasonable thinking person believe that that scope of destruction could even be possibly caused by a mere deficiency? The other major problem here is that all of this destruction happened in an amazingly short period of time. How could any reasonable thinking person believe? So basically, he's implying that the researchers who are doing these studies are unintelligent or they are not reasonable thinking people. This is not scientific writing. This is opinion piece, basically personal attacks on the people who are doing the research. Even with that, his perspectives are off base. The way he's supporting his perspectives, it's crazy. I mean, I came to this perspective with an open mind, like maybe this vitamin A stuff is legit because people are, having all these anecdotal experience. But then when we're looking at the foundations of it with the studies, it's like there's not really good support for what Grant's saying, or at least Grant is not supporting it well. And apparently he's the founder of this idea. So you would think that the ideas would stand on a much better foundation than what he's provided here, even with the deficiency study. So let's actually jump into that. We start to see what he uses to support his perspective. So the first piece is Grant questions the deficiency idea by challenging the timeline in which the deficiency symptoms develop. So Grant says on page 86 in his book, if that long list of disease and tissue destruction did not cause them, aka the rats, or the researchers, to pause and deeply and very seriously question their deficiency concept, then the speed at which it happened surely should have. Most of the animals in the experiments had become extremely sick by the 8th week of being on a specifically designed deficiency diet. By the 8th week, many of the animals were too weak, sick, and diseased even to feed themselves. The thing is, and we talked about this in the toxicity studies, is that proportionally, because a rat's lifespan is so much shorter than a human's lifespan, if we wanted to see how long that would be relative to a human's lifespan, we are basically looking at 4 to 5 years. So the rats were on a deficiency diet for proportionally what would be proportionally equivalent to a human for 4 to 5 years. So we have here from the research to say 1 human year almost equals 2 rat weeks, 13.8 rat days, while correlating their entire lifespans. So Grant positions as a mere 8 to 10 weeks. But in reality, if we look at this proportionately to human lifespans, this would be roughly around 4 to 5 years. So it's not actually that short of a time frame on a proportional basis. Grant starts to challenge the deficiency idea by basically questioning the symptom profile of vitamin A deficiency, saying like,
Look, these symptoms are so bad. How could a mere vitamin or mineral deficiency actually create this?
So he says here in his book on page 87, once again, seeing all this disease and destruction in response to a mere deficiency is so completely illogical. What any reasonable and thinking person would expect to see in response to a mere deficiency is a slow wasting and general tissue atrophy. After all, this is the response that's always been witnessed in nature and witnessed for over thousands of years too, due to prolonged, even complete starvation. Clearly, then there was something else drastically wrong with the artificial deficiency diet used in these lab experiments. First things first is, again, this tone in the book is extremely condescending towards the researchers who have done the research. And so if you are going to come with this tone, you should actually come with some strong support for your arguments, which Grant did not in his book here. And again, we're talking about these specific rat studies because this is what Grant used to lay the foundation for his book, saying,
Look, deficiency doesn't exist. The vitamin A is super toxic.
and it's like, where's the proof? You're not providing it in the book. Again, I'm going to go through this. I'm going to support my claim. So with this in mind, I want to start to look at other deficiency diseases, other vitamin and mineral deficiency disease processes. So the first one we have here is scurvy, and scurvy is vitamin C deficiency. And what they say about scurvy is scurvy can begin to occur within 4 to 12 weeks in humans, and it can lead to quite extreme symptoms. Initially, non-specific symptoms of scurvy emerge after 4 to 12 weeks of insufficient intake of vitamin C. Patients might present with fatigue, malaise, lethargy, and anorexia. Subsequently, patients with scurvy experience oral and skin symptoms such as bleeding gums, easy bruising, skin rashes, fragility, delayed wound healing, and bone and joint aches. Even in 4 to 12 weeks in humans, which with Grant, he was saying, a mere 8 to 10 weeks. It's like even in 4 to 12 weeks in humans, not in rats, we can see symptoms of scurvy. Now, scurvy, what winds up happening with this vitamin C deficiency is you don't have enough vitamin C to make the collagenous proteins and structure of your vasculature. So you basically just bleed in all of your organs and eventually die. And so some of the things that we see is painful joint swelling, bleeding in the joints, bleeding in the bones due to vascular fragility caused by impaired collagen formation. They say disrupted endochondral bone formation that can result in fragile bones that are prone to fractures. And they say ocular symptoms, including dry eyes, subconjunctival hemorrhages, so bleeding in the eyes, and scleral icterus, so changing color of the sclera. They say if left untreated, severe scurvy can induce profound weakness, difficulty breathing, swelling, as another name for that is anasarca, hemolysis, which is basically the red blood cells breaking apart, jaundice, so liver damage, seizures, organ failure, and ultimately death. So essentially, the reason I'm laughing here is this is not a joke, but it's like we have another vitamin deficiency, specifically with vitamin C, that happens in a 4 to 12 week time frame and causes absolute destruction of the body's tissues. So is it really fair to say who in their right mind would think that it's logical for a vitamin or mineral to cause symptoms like this? It's like, yes, it is fair. We see this with vitamin C. So why wouldn't we see it with something like vitamin A as well? Another example we have is beriberi, which is thiamine deficiency. And there's 3 types of beriberi. There's wet beriberi, essentially is heart failure, destruction of the heart and the heart's function. Then you have dry beriberi, which is destruction of the peripheral nerves, so the nerves in your body, the thalamus in the brain, mammillary bodies and cerebellum, so portions of the brain, and then also decreased blood flow that basically leads to sensory neuropathy and eventually muscle wasting. And we also have Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, which you typically see in alcoholics because alcohol depletes thiamine. And what happens here is you basically have people who have completely impaired consciousness and go into what Korsakoff psychosis, where they basically have complete mental confusion. They're not able to talk. They can't remember events. And then basically their entire cognitive processes decline. So again, this is from thiamine deficiency, a B vitamin. You get heart failure, destruction of your nervous system, both central and peripheral, and also complete destruction of consciousness over time. I've worked in the ICU with people who have dealt with this, chronic alcoholics, and the first thing we do is we give them IV thiamine because they're often rankly deficient and it starts to improve a variety of their functions. something to consider is we have another deficiency of a vitamin that can cause pretty significant destruction and damage to different tissues in the body. So I don't think it's completely illogical to think that vitamin A can have some serious problems if you don't get enough. The last one I'll mention here is pellagra. And with pellagra, it's vitamin B3 deficiency, a niacin deficiency. And you essentially can see the peeling and loss of skin on your hands, feet, and around your neck. You can also see ulceration and inability to regenerate the mucous membranes, your mouth. They also talk about in the urethra, the urinary tract. And then you also see gastrointestinal problems where the GI tract is actually unable to maintain the lining. So you see bloody diarrhea and ulceration all throughout the GI tract. And you also get severe cognitive dysfunction, including psychosis, encephalopathy, which is basically like you knock out your consciousness, and dementia. So not having enough vitamin B3 can cause severe cognitive issues over time. And it's the same thing for the GI tract, for the mucous membranes, and also for the skin. So we're seeing complete destruction across multiple body systems if you don't have enough vitamin C, if you don't have enough vitamin B1, which is thiamine, and if you don't have enough vitamin B3, which is niacin. There's also problems in multiple body systems with deficiencies of other vitamins and minerals. I just listed these three. I'm not going to take up all the time here talking about it, but we see pretty serious issues. So with this said, I don't think it's illogical that vitamin A deficiency could cause a problem. And we also see that the proportional timeline between humans and rats for the deficiency, 8 to 10 weeks, is actually not that short. And then also even in humans, for something like scurvy, we're seeing deficiency within 4 to 12 weeks. These are all reasonable things that we can see. So Grant doesn't disprove anything with those statements. He just comes off as condescending and provides no evidence for his support, which for me is like, I think that's problematic, especially if you're going to create a perspective that vitamin A deficiency doesn't really exist, is actually toxicity, or that it's, at least in deficiency studies, they're not seeing this deficiency. And it's illogical to think that this deficiency could provide all of these symptoms. It's like, no, it actually is completely logical. And we're seeing that with other vitamins and minerals. Now, let's get into the meat and the potatoes of Grant's argument around the deficiency studies, basically showing that vitamin A deficiency doesn't exist. It was just vitamin A toxicity. He discusses this in the podcast with Elwin Robinson, and Elwin tells people to read the book, I think, on this specific chapter to discuss these points. And so we're going to actually cover this very specifically, this whole perspective of Grant around the vitamin A deficiency. And so to start, Grant actually talks about a seminal study, the Wolbach and Howe study. He calls it the premier vitamin A deficiency study. And he sets this study up as like one of the best studies that we could look at for vitamin A deficiency. I'm going to read you a specific quotes on it. And then after that, he tries to destroy the study. He tries to break down the study and tell us what the researchers did wrong. But again, spoiler alert, he doesn't do a good job of doing that. He doesn't support his points well at all. In the Wolbach and Howe study, they basically give rats 2 diets. I have the diet up here on the screen. So it was casein, starch, salt mixture, lard or butter. So the lard group was the low vitamin A group because lard does not have very much vitamin A at all, despite whatever Grant says or rationalizes in his book. I'm not just saying that. I'm going to break down that perspective in this video. And then the other group is the butter group, which had vitamin A because butter has a significantly higher amount of vitamin A than lard. The last thing they got was brewer's yeast. This provides some vitamins and some minerals. So we have 2 groups, same diet. One group got lard, one group got butter. Lard doesn't have a lot of vitamin A. Butter has a lot of vitamin A. Lard group deficient, butter group not deficient. Lard group sick and died. Vitamin A group or butter group, no problems. And if you had the lard group where the animals got deficient and started to get sick, if you then feed them on butter, they get better. That's the general take of this study. And this is what Grant tries to break down. But first, he builds up the study to support his perspective. So let's actually look at some of the quotes here that Grant actually goes through. Grant starts out here on page 93, and he says, what's so important about Wolbach and Howe's 1925 study is that not only is it the premier study that proved the enormous scope and devastation caused by the so-called deficiency, it is also the study referenced today as being the one to definitively close the case on the vitamin A deficiency theory. This is Grant's own words coming out of Grant's own book. So I don't want to hear anybody saying, oh, the Wolbach and Howe study, it's not that good, it's garbage, it's whatever. It's like Grant is saying this study is the premier study that closes the case on vitamin A deficiency theory. He's saying this is the study, right? Grant specifically says this in his book. and this is on page 94, he says Wolbach and Howe's 1925 study is probably one of the most comprehensive vitamin A deficiency studies done in this era. Not only does this study investigate the broader scope and magnitude of vitamin A deficiency, in quotations, induced disease conditions, it in parallel runs the needed control experiments. My perspective on this study is that it was well designed and well conducted. They conduct rigorous and thorough postmortem, so after the rats were dead, investigations of the extent of all the affected organs and tissues. Overall, the report is excellent, and I encourage you to read it in detail, and I read it in detail as per Grant's encouragement. The report completely supports and reconfirms the vitamin A deficiency theory. Additionally, to prevent the complication or conflation of follow-up infections, they keep the animal cages meticulously clean and keep only 1 animal per cage, actually ruling out the involvement and contribution infections make in the overall disease picture is one of the key objections of this particular study, because if you don't have enough vitamin A, immune function actually takes a hit. He further goes on page 95. They then go on to enumerate the other studies that have resulted in wholly negative results and attempt to rationalize them away with not much more than a single sentence. Although this should alert us to the high probability that Wolbach and Howe had some biases, even still, I don't really think their apparent biases were a big factor, since the results that they were looking at were indeed powerfully compelling. So let's see this. If Grant is the low vitamin A guru, he is basically saying, I think this study, I don't think there's a lot of bias in this study. I still think these results are good. So we are removing this argument from the table as we continue. He says here, however, they do make a simple and fundamental scientific mistake. It's a deceptively simple mistake. I believe they were led into making this mistake by the accounts of the very earliest researchers using butter and cod liver oil as sources of high concentrations of vitamin A. As a means of adding vitamin A back into the baseline diet, they substitute out the lard by replacing it with butter. So basically what he's saying is the big problem with this study is instead of using purified vitamin A, they use butter. This sets the stage for Grant to actually try to break down the Wolbach and Howe study. So it's this premier study. It's the definitive answer. It's great. But the researchers messed up is basically what Grant says, because they use butter instead of using purified vitamin A. So I'm going to address that later in this video. So stay tuned for that. But first, how is Grant going to break down this study? Well, he talks about it there's 4 specific attempts that he tries to break down. So the first 2 is that when you change butter, you change more than just vitamin A content. You actually increase the vitamin A in the diet with butter, and you also change the fatty acid profile with butter from lard. And basically the change in fatty acids, the more saturated fat and cholesterol in the butter would better emulsify the vitamin A and would protect the rats from the toxic vitamin A that they would have been getting in the lard and also in the butter. So basically the 2 first arguments he breaks down here is that the change from lard to butter led to more vitamin D in the butter group, also more vitamin A. He does state that because it's true. And then also that the fatty acid composition of the diet, which would lead to better emulsification. So on page 96, he lays this out for us. And he says, however, and somewhat counterintuitively, we can't jump to their conclusion that the vitamin A in the butter was solely responsible either. That's because the substitution of butter in place of lard had not changed just one variable in their control experiment, not at all. Rather, it had changed at least 3 variables at the same time. They added vitamin A, which is true. They've added vitamin D, which is blatantly false. And more importantly, they've changed the composition of the fat, which is true, but it doesn't matter. And I'm going to talk about this. The 2 pieces there is adding vitamin D and changing fatty acid composition was the first way he tries to destroy Wolbach and Howe's study. And then the next 2 pieces is that he starts to talk about lard and casein. He goes on page 96 and he said, but there's a hidden 4th variable they changed with this simple butter substitution in the place of lard. It is something they could not have known about. It's not what they added into the diet. It's what they've taken out of the diet. And he says later on page 97, yes, it's retinoic acid, the chemotherapy drug. The rats in these experiments were simply chemoed to death. If true, where was the retinoic acid coming from? Well, there are 2 sources of it. And the 2 sources that he goes on to talk about is lard was the source of retinoic acid in the vitamin A deficiency group, and casein was a source of retinoic acid as well. Maybe there was some retinoic acid, but not enough to make a difference. And I have another study to refute this point. And also definitely not more retinoic acid or vitamin A that was in the butter. So these are both moot points. First, I'm going to break down Grant's perspective using his own citations, and I'm going to show you another study after to just put the nail in the coffin. Grant claims that the researchers changed more than one variable because they added butter back into the diet. And so I'm going to share this Notion page here, which, by the way, will be available for everybody to check. My research on here, the quotes are here, the page number in Grant's book is here. All the studies are cited here, so you can go through, see everything, check all of my work. It's free for everybody to see so that they can, see, come to the same conclusions, not come to the same conclusions. I'm happy to share my work. So Grant's quote here is he says, again, we're talking about vitamin D3 content of butter. And he says, that's because the substitution of butter in place of lard had not changed just one variable in their control experiment, not at all. Rather, it had changed at least 3 variables at the same time. They added vitamin A, they added vitamin D, and more importantly, they changed the composition of fats. So first point, let's get through this vitamin D stuff. We need to see what's the vitamin D content of butter versus the vitamin D content of lard. And we have a study here. The study is titled The Vitamin D Content of English Butter Fat Throughout the Year. It's from 1942. There's a table here, and we have different dates where they collected the butter. We have the amount of vitamin D in the butter fat. And basically it ranges from 0.07 IUs of vitamin D per gram of butter fat all the way up at the max of 0.97 IUs of vitamin D per gram of butter fat. And the researchers say that the 0.7 may be a faulty number, but either way, we're going to run with that. So with butter per gram of butter fat, we have from 0.07 to 0.97 IUs of vitamin D. So the question is, how much vitamin D is in 1 gram of lard? So I couldn't find the actual vitamin D content in 1 gram of lard. If you look at the USDA databases, which I'll show you below, we see clearly that lard has much more vitamin D than butter, but I wanted to actually have a study that shows this and not just rely on the USDA databases. I found a study telling us the amount of vitamin D in the adipose tissue of pigs being raised for consumption. So they say the adipose content of 25 hydroxy vitamin D content was greater in sun pigs or pigs exposed to the sun. So you have 0.14 micrograms per 100 grams versus in the control pigs, which is 0.4 micrograms per 100 grams. Basically, they say your vitamin D3 content was not different between groups. The sun pigs had about 184 IUs per 100 grams, whereas the controls had about 164 IUs per 100 grams. So if we break down 164 to 184 IU of vitamin D3 per 100 grams, we divide those number by 100 because we want to get that into just grams. And so basically we see is for lard, we have 1.64 IU to 1.8 IU of vitamin D3 per 1 gram of subcutaneous adipose tissue in pigs. Now, subcutaneous adipose tissue in pigs actually has a bunch of connective tissue and other components. So when you make lard, you actually get rid of those components. So you can actually assume that the vitamin D3 content would be more concentrated than what's listed here. But even without that factor in consideration, what we are seeing is that the lard has more vitamin D3 than butter. So first point for Grant, untrue. Butter does not have more vitamin D3 than lard. This is important to some extent because vitamin D3 is protective against vitamin A toxicity. If you have both of them together, it actually raises the threshold for toxicity for vitamin A. So basically what we're seeing here is lard has more vitamin D3 than butter. So if anything, the rats on the butter diet were getting less vitamin D3. So this basically breaks down Grant's perspective. I also, for anybody checking out the notes, put the amount of vitamin D3 that we see in lard versus butter from the USDA databases. What we see is 1 IU of vitamin D3 per gram of fat for lard and 0.127 IU of vitamin D3 per gram of fat for butter. These actually line up with the values that I just pulled from those studies above. Point number 2, Grant claims that the researchers changed more than one variable because butter has different fatty acids than lard, which those fatty acids would better emulsify the vitamin A. Grant's quote here, that's because the substitution of butter in place of lard had not changed just one variable in their control experiment, not at all. Rather, it changed at least 3 variables. Those 3 variables he talked about, they added vitamin A, they added vitamin D, and they changed the fat composition. He says here in 1925, it was more or less assumed that a fat was a fat, and it was thought to just be a source of food energy. the butter fats most certainly could have much better emulsification properties than does lard in regard to the retinoids. So sure, maybe the butter has better emulsification properties for vitamin A than the lard, but there's two problems in this. One, does emulsifying vitamin A make it less toxic? And the answer is no. We have a quote here from the paper: water miscible, emulsified, and solid forms of retinol supplements are more toxic than oil-based preparations. And they say chronic hypervitaminosis A is induced after daily doses of 2 milligrams of retinol per kilogram in oil-based preparations for many months or years. In contrast, doses as low as 0.2 milligrams of retinol per kilogram per day in water miscible, emulsified, and solid preparations for only a few weeks cause chronic hypervitaminosis A. Thus, water miscible, emulsified, and solid preparations of retinol are about 10 times as toxic as oil-based retinol preparations. So basically, what we are seeing here is that maybe butter emulsifies vitamin A better, which Grant provides no source for. But even if it does emulsify it better, it would be arguable that that protects you more so from the vitamin A than if it was not as emulsified in the lard, which would be the oil-based preparation. So basically, it's not an argument. There's no argument here. The other thing that is kind of hilarious about this is that the butter has higher vitamin A content. So if this argument were indeed true, then is Grant saying that we can just eat more butter and then that would protect us from the vitamin A, even though it has more vitamin A? So is the solution to our vitamin A toxicity to just eat more butter? That's the same trend that argument moves into, which is tenuous from his overall perspective. So there's an incongruency from his perspective with what he's saying here specifically, which is why I think that it seems like he backwardsly rationalized his perspectives. Vitamin A is toxic, and then how am I going to make this work from the research? Because these claims are not borne out. We already see there's not more vitamin D3 in butter. And also what we're seeing here is that emulsifying vitamin A makes it potentially more toxic. So you can't sit here and say that adding butter that emulsifies vitamin A makes it safer than lard. Plus, the butter has higher vitamin A concentration than lard by a significant amount, which we'll see in just a second. Now, the third claim here, the deficient rats developed not vitamin A deficiency. They developed vitamin A toxicity because lard contains retinoic acid. And the quotes that we have here from Grant, this was the third piece. He says, but there's a hidden fourth variable they change with this simple butter substitution in place of lard. It is something they could not have known about. It's not what they added into the diet. It's what they taken out of the diet. Yes, it's retinoic acid, the chemotherapy drug. Again, like this is hyperbolic exaggerations. He says the rats in these experiments were simply chemoed to death. If true, where was the retinoic acid coming from? Okay, so lard is rendered pig's fat, and that fat would normally have significant levels of various forms of vitamin A contained within it. But after rendering, lard is reported to have virtually no vitamin A, or maybe only trace amounts of it. So what happens to the original quantity of it? Well, it mostly gets separated off into the yellow. Yes, retinol is yellow, less market appealing lards. However, the separation process is not 100% perfectly efficient. More importantly, remember, retinol is easily converted into retinoic acid via oxidation. All that's needed to create the oxidation reaction is heat and oxygen. Ample amounts of both are present in the rendering process used to produce lards. Therefore, the lard in these experiments contained retinoic acid. He does not actually show any proof that the lard in these experiments contained retinoic acid. Zero. He just assumes that it's there based on this sophist argument he promotes here about lard. Because the first thing is that the retinol content of lard is already low. And then in these studies, they're processing the lard to remove the retinol. And it's like, sure, maybe some of the retinol will be converted into retinoic acid, but a large portion of that's going to be removed, and there already isn't a lot. So Grant does go on and he does cite another researcher, and he says other researchers at the same time conferred that lard does indeed also contain vitamin A. According to Herb et al., lard contains 0.5 to 2 IUs of vitamin A per gram. So 0.5 to 2 IUs, extremely low amount, especially considering that it would probably be even lower than what the amounts were specified by Herb et al., because the fat sources in these studies are actually treated to remove the vitamin A content. Either way, how much retinoic acid would these rats actually be receiving if we assume that this lard had 0.5 to 2 IUs of vitamin A per gram. So I'm going to use Grant's own citations here to disprove his point. Grant cites another study in his book. And with this study, he's basically saying
lard has some magical vitamin A components that we can't test. That you're not seeing it on fluorescence or chromatography. And that must be retinoic acid because it doesn't show up in these metrics.
And the Herb et al. Paper was actually created to address this. So Herb et al. Say here, as a quote, biological assays on molecular distillates from lard showed that lard contains vitamin A activity equivalent to about 0.4 to 2 units per gram. So it's the 0.5 to 2 IUs of vitamin A per gram. It is concluded that the biological vitamin A activity of lard is largely attributable to the presence of typical vitamin A. The so-called sparing action of lard on utilization of added vitamin A in diets is in all probability due to the presence in lard of hitherto unrecognized typical vitamin A. So this magical sparing property of lard is probably just from normal vitamin A. This is Grant's own reference. This is the Herb et al. Paper. This is what they are saying. The next piece here is let's see actually how much vitamin A the rats in this study would have gotten from the lard. So basically what we see, we have the diet here again. The diet was casein, starch, salt mixture, lard, and brewer's yeast. It was about 24% lard. Then we have a quote from the Wolbach and Howe study. The daily ration per rat was 5 grams. So the vitamin A consumed in a diet is essentially 5-gram diet by 24% of that 5-gram diet being lard. Gives us about 1.2 grams of lard per day. We need to know this because we know how much IUs of vitamin A we have per gram of lard. So now we can figure out the vitamin A. So what we're seeing is there's 0.5 to 2 IUs of vitamin A per gram of lard. If we multiply that by 1.2 grams of lard per day, we get 0.6 to 2.4 IU of vitamin A per day on the Wolbach and Howe deficiency diet. So basically, at most, based on Grant's own references, the rats would have received 0.6 to 2.4 IU per day of retinoic acid. At most, that's assuming all the vitamin A in the lard was converged retinoic acid through the heating process. This is a study that I'm going to go through fully in just a couple minutes here. But basically, there's another study where the rats are supplemented with 165 IUs of retinoic acid per day and do just fine. So not 0.5 or 0.6 to 2.4, 165. So many times larger, and the rats actually do okay. They say, since in these experiments, we were interested only in the maximal effects of vitamin A acid, excessive doses were given. 3 feedings a week provided a dosage level equivalent to at least 50 micrograms per day, which is 165 IU. The conversion equivalent is 3.3 IUs for every microgram of vitamin A. They say weanling rats were divided into 3 groups, all placed simultaneously on the standard vitamin A deficient test diet. One group was supplemented with vitamin A. The second group was supplemented with vitamin A acid, which is retinoic acid, both dissolved in cottonseed oil. So vitamin A was retinol, vitamin A acid is retinoic acid, and the third group was given the same amount of cottonseed oil alone. The growth of these animals is shown in figure 3. We'll see that in just a bit. For the first 5 weeks in the diet, all 3 groups grew about equally. The unsupplemented animals, the animals that didn't receive vitamin A, stopped growing, declined rapidly in weight, and by the end of the 8th week, all had died. The animals receiving supplements of vitamin A and of vitamin A acid, retinoic acid, grew equally well throughout the experiment for 140 days. So at a massively higher dose of retinoic acid, 165 IUs, not 0.6 to 2.4 IUs, the rats actually lived to 140 days without any obvious problems. In this other study that was done in 1960s titled The Biological Function of Vitamin A Acid. So we're seeing the retinoic acid, even if it's not super toxic as Grant is saying, especially in this extremely low dosage, which we're getting that dosage from Grant's own citations. So what we are seeing here is no, in the lard group where the animals got quite sick because they were vitamin A deficient, they did not get poisoned by retinoic acid or chemo to death. That is completely false, or at the minimum is not supported by what Grant's arguments say inside the video. If anything, his own citations disprove his perspective. The fourth way that Grant tried to actually break down the Wolbach study is he was claiming that the rats were poisoned by receiving casein. So Grant says, this is quotes on page 100, another significant source of vitamin A in the earlier vitamin A deficiency experiments would have been the milk protein casein. Casein acts as a carrier molecule for retinol and highly bonds with it. It normally contains a relatively high concentration of vitamin A. Even if that were the case, it is irrelevant. It's absolutely irrelevant. Why do I say that? Because both the experimental group that received lard and the control group that received butter got casein, right? So if we look at the diet, what we see, 18% casein. The only difference between these diets is one group got lard and one group got butter. And the lard group got sick and the butter group didn't. How are we going to say that there's retinoic acid and casein and it's poisoning the rats if both groups are getting casein and one group is getting symptoms and dying and the other group is not? There's no argument here. It's like a mic drop. It's done. There's nothing that can be added from it. And just to show the quote here, they say, control rats on the same diet, but with butter fat prepared from fresh butter by melting and washing in hot water in place of lard, grew normally and have been maintained in normal, healthy conditions for a year. So what we see is control rats on the same diet. So this exact same diet that I'm showing you here with butter fat grew normally and have been maintained in normal, healthy condition for a year. If casein had so much toxic retinoic acid, wouldn't you assume that the butter-fed rats would also have gotten sick? We already clarified the point that even if the butter was somehow protective, because it emulsified it better, the emulsification process would actually make it worse. And even further than that is, are we saying that if somebody's vitamin A deficient, we can just give them butter because it emulsifies the retinoic acid and now they're protected? Is that the solution to these people who are dealing with this vitamin A toxicity, that they just need to have butter? Because in the study here, they say the control diet was tested for its curative properties and its administration was always followed by prompt amelioration and disappearance of the signs and symptoms of the deficient state. So if you took the rats fed lard that got really sick and then you gave them butter instead of lard, they were cured. So is this what we have to do for people as well? Is this Grant's argument that we're going to provide butter, which has much higher amounts of vitamin A in the form of retinol than lard? And then that's what's going to heal people of their vitamin A toxicity? These points that Grant are making to disprove the Wolbach and Howe study that he says is the premier study, there's no refutation here. None of his points actually refute this in his own book. And when you start to go through and do the digging on the papers he cites, his own citations are disproving him. I mean, this is the major problem with this perspective. I was open to the idea that there may be some, like vitamin A may have more toxicity than we initially thought. And then what we're seeing is the toxicity dosage in the previous video I did, which you can check out. The toxicity doses are insane. And it's like, well, actually, we are seeing deficiency in these animals and vitamin A is correcting it. In all of his refutations, the four major refutations he tried to promote, that those rats got more vitamin D3 in the butter group, that the butter protected the rats because of emulsification, that the lard actually had retinoic acid and that casein has retinoic acid. All of these are not true claims. They're either not true or they don't matter in this perspective. So I'm not trying to use the rat studies to prove all the points, but it's like, this is the foundational arguments that have been laid out for the vitamin A perspective. And they're not holding up to water. They're not passing the test here. So then we have to start questioning if people are actually getting better, which I'm going to make a video and talk about. What are the reasons they're getting better? Is it really because vitamin A is toxic, or is it because there's something else going on? And I think there's something else going on. So stay tuned for that video. The last piece I want to show here is we have another study that actually breaks this down. The study is titled The Biological Function of Vitamin A Acid. And it does some really interesting things because it basically corrects all the problems that Grant cites in breaking down Wolbach's study. So the way the study is laid out is we have three groups. We have a vitamin A alcohol group, which is they receive retinol in cottonseed oil. Then we have a vitamin A acid group, which is retinoic acid, the chemotherapy, and they got that in cottonseed oil. And then we have another group which didn't receive vitamin A and they just got cottonseed oil. So they say here, wheeling rats were divided into three groups, all placed simultaneously on a standard vitamin A deficient test diet. One group was supplemented with vitamin A, the second with vitamin A acid, both dissolved in cottonseed oil, and the third group was given the same amount of cottonseed oil alone. How much vitamin A were they given? 50 micrograms per day, which is 165 IUs per day of vitamin A. They say in these experiments, we were interested only in the maximal effects of vitamin A acid. Excessive doses were given. 3 feedings a week provided a dosage level equivalent to at least 50 micrograms per day. Basically, what we see in this study, after the 8th week, all the animals that didn't receive either retinol or retinoic acid, they just got cottonseed oil, they died. So they say here the growth of these animals is shown in figure 3. For the first 5 weeks in the diet, All three groups grew about equally. Then the unsupplemented animals stopped growing, declined rapidly in weight, and by the end of the 8th week, all had died. The animals receiving supplements of vitamin A and a vitamin A acid, so retinol, retinoic acid, grew equally well throughout the experiment. So we have a graph here. What we see in this graph, 140 days in the diet, vitamin A deficient animals die around the 60th day. Vitamin A animal supplemented retinol make it to 140 days. Vitamin A acid supplemented the retinoic acid make it to 140 days. The next thing we see is they did some interesting components where basically if you have vitamin A deficient animals, you don't give them the vitamin A at all, neither retinoic acid nor retinol from the time that they're weanling. And before they die, somewhere between the 4th and 7th week, you give them either retinol or retinoic acid. They miraculously recover. So they say here, to test further the biological effectiveness of vitamin A acid, this supplement was withheld in our experiments until the 4th and 7th week of the vitamin A deficient diet. That is until the animals had stopped gaining or were rapidly losing weight. On administration of vitamin A acid, retinoic acid, toxic chemotherapy, according to Grant, such animals began at once to grow and soon appeared identical with those supplemented from the start of the experiment. Also, any signs of vitamin A deficiency that had developed on the deficient diet rapidly healed, except for occasional scarring of the cornea owing to earlier xerophthalmia, so the drying of the eyes, which remained permanently. So if we have deficient rats and we give them either retinoic acid or retinol before they're about to die, they actually recover and all their symptoms go away, except for the damage to the eyes. Now, the next one, what they do is they feed animals retinoic acid, and then they stop feeding them retinoic acid, and then they give them retinoic acid again. And the reason we're looking at this is because retinoic acid is not stored in the body. And so what happens is while you're giving it, you won't have vitamin A deficiency. But as soon as you remove it, since it's not stored, you get vitamin A deficiency. And then when you give it again, you correct the vitamin A deficiency. So toxic chemotherapy, retinoic acid, according to Grant, is actually what we're going to see here, saves these rats from deficiency. They say those receiving supplements of vitamin A alcohol rapidly increase their stores. So that's retinol. Those supplemented with vitamin A acid, however, lost their initial stores of vitamin A as rapidly as the rats receiving no supplements. Both groups also developed night blindness at the same time. Vitamin A acid not only fails to contribute vitamin A to the liver, but seems to have no sparing action on vitamin A already there. So they give us a nice little graphic. So we have vitamin A. It can be stored in esters. So retinol palmitate as an example. It can be interconverted to retinolaldehyde, which goes to create visual pigments. And then it can also, retinolaldehyde or the retinol can be converted to retinoic acid. Now, retinoic acid, if you look at these arrows, cannot be reverse converted into retinolaldehyde. Once it becomes retinoic acid, it's retinoic acid. It doesn't go back to storage. So basically, while you're getting retinoic acid, you have enough vitamin A. But as soon as you stop it, you can be deficient if you're only getting retinoic acid because it doesn't convert back into storage. So it gets used. That's basically the major piece there. What we see here is they have animals. They feed them retinoic acid. They stop, and then they feed them again. So let's see what the researchers have to say. They say one consequence of the failure to store either vitamin A or the acid is that these animals, though normal in weight and in excellent health, respond almost immediately to interruption of the supplementation. Animals growing well on vitamin A acid, on removing the supplement, stop growing within a few days, decline rapidly in weight, and within 3 to 5 weeks die, displaying all the signs of severe vitamin A deficiency. That is, these animals respond as do young animals on a vitamin A deficient diet after all internal stores of vitamin A have been exhausted. If the supplementation with vitamin A acid is renewed, even towards terminal stages of deficiency, such animals rapidly recover. So we have a graph here. What we see is the animals are fed retinoic acid. They up to about 140 days. Then from 140 and to about 170 days, retinoic acid is removed, right? So because it's not stored, they start to get deficiency. What happens between 140 and 170 days? A couple of the rats die. And then when they give the animals retinoic acid again at around that 170 day mark, well, look, what do you know? The rat actually starts to recover. Is retinoic acid a toxic chemotherapy agent and vitamin A deficiency doesn't exist? Or is it actually correcting vitamin A deficiency here and saving these rats from death? And that's what looks like the case is. Basically, what we're seeing with this study is Grant is saying,
oh, look, you can't use butter. We need to use only specifically vitamin A to get at a real test. And oh, retinoic acid is super toxic.
And it's like, here's a study using specifically retinoic acid that's preventing deficiency in the rats. It's not chemoing them to death. When you remove retinoic acid after feeding them because it's not stored, they die. And then when you replace with retinoic acid, they actually recover. And if you have rats that are deficient in vitamin A, and then you give them higher dose retinoic acid, especially than the 0.5 or 0.6 to 2.4 IUs that Grant claims is in the lard, it actually rescues them. So 164 IUs rescues these rats from the deficiency state. This study puts a nail in the coffin on the claims or the debunking attempt that Grant tries to put on the Wolbach and Howe study that he calls the premier vitamin A deficiency study. I'm not seeing a refutation of vitamin A deficiency here, whether it's from the timeline, whether it's from the extent of damage seen with it, whether it's because of how the experiments are done. Grant has not supported his claims here with his book. And again, we're going to the book because when people say,
oh, you don't know about this vitamin A stuff, you just read Poisoning for Profits, read Grant's work.
Here you go, guys. We're taking the time. We're taking the energy. We're giving Grant the respect and coming at it from a perspective of maybe this guy's right. And then when we're going through the research, it's like, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing the results. And we're doing it piece by piece. That's the perspective on deficiency studies. I'm not seeing Grant's claims playing out here. Now, if you're interested in getting away from the dietary dogma and all the confusion around, do I have vitamin A? Do I not? Do I take this vitamin or not that vitamin? Do I eat carbs or not? You can check out the nutrition blueprint on my website, which is a video course and a PDF guide that shows you how to start setting up your diet, get past all of this craziness, all of these dietary wars and dogma, and you can start to get started on setting up your diet today. And remember to stay tuned for the next video in this vitamin A series where I break down Garrett Smith's claims and also Grant's claims on vitamin A toxicity through metabolism, storage, excretion, etc., and the accumulation over time. I hope you like this video. Please leave a comment down below. Go through the work in the link that I'm going to leave here on my Notion page where you can see all the citations and the documents, and let me know if you find any discrepancies. Happy to adjust perspective if I was wrong somewhere, and happy to further this conversation.